All right, I'm going to turn on the slideshow.
Well, welcome everyone who has joined us today. We think we have a really great group. We had over 40 people registered, so I don't know if all those folks are here, but we have a great program for you, and thanks for being with us. This is Risa Shimoda. I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society, and we are a national organization of professionals who support the study, protection, and management of North America's rivers. Happy to have you here, and I also wanted to briefly introduce my colleague who you won't see, but you will hear in a minute, Angie Furman.
Hi, everyone. Yep, you can't see me, but my name is Angie Furman, and I am the River Training Center Coordinator for the River Management Society, and we're happy that you're all joining us today. So thanks for coming.
Okay, fellows, you can take it away.
Okay, thanks. So there we go. Thanks everybody for joining. I asked for a show of hands, but we know how badly that would work. Thanks everybody for being here on a Friday afternoon. My name is Bo Shelby. I'm with Confluence Research and Consulting, and we've got 3 presenters today. That would be Dan Shelby, Doug Whitaker, and me from Confluence. We have 4 panelists that have agreed to join us, and you'll get to see their faces at one time or another. I think maybe I'm not sure which one you can see now. I shouldn't be guessing about that, but our panelists are Liz Lacey from the Park Service in Connecticut, Dave Cernicek from the Forest Service in Jackson, Wyoming, Judy Culver from BLM in Taos, and Bob Ratcliffe from the Park Service in Washington, D.C. That's about as diverse a group as we could have planned, so we'll claim that we planned it. We've got participants. Again, we don't know exactly the difference between the list of people that have signed up versus who's actually here, but assuming that who's here is who was signed up, we've got people from all over the country, a bunch of different states. That's pretty cool. From a variety of agencies, federal, state, and local, plus some NGOs and outfitters and private boaters, and some consultants and researchers. A few months ago, we had a webinar that started out with the idea of possibly having a season without river trips. Here we are a couple of months later, and now it's more like people are coming, like it or not. So what are we going to do about that? And so that's what we get to talk about for the next 60 minutes or so. And the logistics of this is that we'll go through topics that were covered in the survey that was sent out during the 2 weeks in the middle of May. We'll have a topic. There will be a graph with some data about that topic from the survey. We'll talk briefly about some examples from our own experience and then get some comments from our panelists from their experiences. So we'll see how that works. This whole medium is a little bit of an experiment for all of us, but that's the general idea. If you're a participant, you can ask questions by typing into the question box. Be very careful that you're typing into the question box and not a comment box or something with some other label. And let's see, Dan, do you have any advice for folks about identifying that? People who don't know which icon it might be or what a question box looks like versus a chat box. There's another thing you shouldn't use.
Well, so everybody should be able to see the GoToWebinar control panel. It's in a separate window than the video or the screen share. And there's a bunch of dark gray menu items, and one of them says questions. And if you're a participant and not a panelist, that's the only way that we will be able to get any feedback from you. So if you have any questions or comments, put them there. We'll do our best to address everything, and there will be time for questions and comments at the end.
Okay, and by the way, yes, we'll try, like Dan said, we'll try to address questions. We're going to kind of do that in groups as we go. We've kind of grouped the topics, so we'll try to do a little bit of that as we go along, and anything that we haven't hit as we go along, we'll try to pick up at the end. So we will try to be responsive to things that show up there. Dan is kind of he's like the air traffic controller on this thing. So if things are going smoothly, that means that Dan probably made it happen that way. If things get screwed up, it's probably something I did and may or may not get fixed anytime soon. So anyway, we'll see how this all goes. Let's go to the first graph, Dan, or the first slide rather. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so like we said, a month or 2 months ago, we had a different picture than what we've got now. We've got the season opening as well as kind of the country opening from the pandemic. And that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. Let's go to the next slide, Dan. So you'll get to see kind of how this works. So the general idea here of the survey was to try and figure out what's going on. And here's an example of some preliminary results. The little box in the middle there, how much use has been occurring at your river since the COVID-19 outbreak? That's the survey question. So every time we show you a graph, it'll have that if you want to try and figure out what the exact question was. And then the responses across the bottom of the graph are the fixed choice responses that people could check in responding to the survey, and then percentages, excuse me, along the left margin. So in this case, asking people about how much use, we had let's see, a little more than 50% combined, right? 20% plus 38% in the less than normal categories, and kind of 10, 11 to 13% in normal to higher than normal categories. Go to the next one, Dan. And then here again, the question, have you noticed changes in activities or user types since the COVID-19 outbreak? And the biggest category here, the largest percentage of responses was that there were more local visitors, followed by more day users and smaller groups of people and more household groups, down around 10%, saying more overnight or more exercise-based activity. So anyway, that's the way the format will work. Next slide, Dan. And just to remind you, I'm guessing that most of the people who are on this, who are participating today, both got the survey, and I'm just guessing lots of you are among our respondents. But just to remind everybody, this was distributed between the 7th and 20th, so the middle 2 weeks in May, it being close to the end of June now. I don't know if that means it's old news or history or recent history or what, but at any rate, these responses are from that time period. It was sent out to the RMS listserv plus people who had participated in the first webinar. We had a total of 79 responses from all over the country, 24 states, lots of regional diversity, lots of diversity among organizations. I think we had higher counts from Forest Service and BLM, but we had the full range of organizations that manage rivers, including, and then also some responses from NGOs and private boaters and outfitters, smaller numbers in those categories. Like we talked about, multiple choice questions, lots of added comments. So people had an opportunity under each one of these questions to add more information if they wanted to, and we got a lot of comments. Okay, I think that's all we needed to know from methods, and I think that takes this on to Dan. This is up to you, right? Dan, we can't hear you. Can't hear you.
All right, here we go. Sorry about that.
There we go. Yep, that's good.
All right, so the prompt for this question was, what parking actions have you taken at your river? And again, remember this went out in mid-May, so I'm guessing that there's a lot fewer places where the parking is completely closed than there was then. And it also this graph shows how A lot of managers are using informative strategies like signs or on-site staffing to enforce spacing rather than structural changes like barriers that would make spacing mandatory, kind of like the cones in these pictures. Ramps are a key area where interactions between household groups are likely. Large ramps have the option to close alternating lanes, but it's harder to manage walk-in. What's that, Bo?
Change your slide.
Oh, sorry about that. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, ramps are a key area where interactions are likely. I guess I don't have to go through all that again. So yeah, walk-in and single lane accesses are hard, especially when there's not a lot of space along the shore for rigging. And again, in this graph, we see a pattern of education used more often than structural or regulatory changes, which more or less leaves the execution of CDC guidelines up to users. An exception to that is we have heard a lot about outfitters that are kind of scheduling and coordinating launches between themselves. As usual, the problem come back to trash and poop. That was one of my favorite comments that we got from the survey. We heard a lot about bathrooms, and it's easy to see why. I've personally seen bathrooms that were taped off and locked, signed closed but left open, or fully open with normal or limited cleaning, and some fully sanitized by a ranger in a hazmat suit. We've also heard stories of vandalism, poop in places where it doesn't belong, littered toilet paper, improvised toilets, and those are generally from places with closed restrooms, but those can also be happening in places where restrooms are open, but people are just don't know about them or are worried about using the public restrooms. And also, it's important to point out in these cases, in cases where the restrooms are fully closed, it's often because managers don't have the staff, the resources, or the PPE to clean properly. The bathroom pictured in the bottom right corner is in Yellowstone. To me, it's looked like it's been closed in a way that still lets people in if they're desperate or if they're unprepared. And that was another thing that we heard a lot of was people signing the bathrooms closed to encourage people to use their own systems or be responsible for their own bathrooms, but leaving them open to prevent people from breaking the door down or, you know, using the bathroom on the outside of the outhouse. Trash, another thing that we've heard a lot of is that trash collection has been a major issue. People have been just leaving trash in places if there's not regular access to bathrooms. All right, so that's the end of my section. And before we move on to Doug, I just wanted to give any of the attendees or any of the panelists who have anything that they want to add to any of the topics that we've talked about so far. I want to give them a chance.
And Bo, you should turn your camera off so that Cernicek can come on.
Okay. And that's a great reminder, Dan, to just kind of slow down and allow a little bit of discussion here. You know, for example, in our recent experience, ramps are a really challenging place in spite of the closure or openness. They're a really challenging place just to kind of move around and be a participant, try and keep yourself distant, but at the same time get your work of getting your boat into the water done. So anything that any of the panelists want to add, let's do that, and I'll turn my camera off.
I guess the biggest thing is, you know, a lot's changed since then. You know, the biggest thing I'm really happy about is we got through high water without people, and that was my biggest fear this year was having the pandemonium of people trying to run high water and get their high water kicks while you know, we had this huge threat, health threat going on, and all the fun of touching people and pulling them out and having them, you know, all that stuff going on. all together in the stew. And I couldn't be more thrilled that the water dropped before we had people showing up. And now we do have people showing up, and we do have full ramps, and the game is on. And so whatever we did a month ago when we were talking about that is there, and we're in the adjustment zone. And you know, the biggest thing that you know, one of my biggest responses to people now, we set up a pretty good game, but the best I can tell people with a lot of things is, hey, you know, guess what? It's my first pandemic. You know, we got some things right, we got some things wrong, and now we're readjusting. You know, some things we overreacted on, some things we didn't react enough on. And this is kind of where we're at now, and our chance to readjust the dials. And the biggest thing I'm regretting right now is, you know, we set everything up based on the state and local requirement or rules and regulations, and now we have nothing from the state and local folks. And, so that's where we're at.
So have you made up your own rules about your ramp scheduling and things like that, or are you just letting the outfitters work it out for themselves?
Actually, where I started was, you know, my agency asked me to, you know, that we all need to have each outfitter make their own COVID plan. And we accept it, but we don't approve it or anything like that, because we don't want the liability of anything like that. We can make them adjust it a little bit if they didn't talk enough about a certain subject, but we're very, very hands off and not regulatory. You know, to me, I've always worked worked with each industry, whether it's fishing or whitewater, you know, as an industry instead of as individuals. One trick of managing outfitter and guides is, if they make the rules, they're more likely to follow them. And you know, whether it's bringing dogs to the river for shuttle drivers or anything like that, if they make the rules, they will follow them. And so I gave them the chance to make the rules. We sat down as a group on video, and, you know, we talked about the topics that we needed to really talk about. You know, how are we going to do transportation? How are we, you know, what are you going to do with your customers when they call you on the phone? Before they get to your company, when they arrive on your front doorstep, when you know, when they step on the bus, when they come to the river, can they bring their own cars to the river? You know, one of the biggest things, biggest messages I had a month ago, and I still have, is the agency has to bend a little bit. You can't just be a stodgy, we're not going to bend agency. You have to adjust with the outfitters and the disease to make this all work. You know, I let my whitewater outfitters have their customers drive to the river because I have space for it. Normally we wouldn't do that, but this is a year where we're doing a lot of extra stuff. If they need an extra boat when they're not allowed an extra boat, just because it means we can space people out of the boats more, we do that, and that's in our plan. But we did make we made an industry plan, and, you know, they came up with stuff where we're only going to have two companies on the ramps over it. And those only the ramp spots at the, you know, upstream and downstream ramp spots are going to be taken, and not the ones in between. Mostly the outfitters came up with that, and I kind of, you know, we signed off on it, and those became the rules. I added quite a few more things into that. My agency was very much about, you know, we don't want to regulate them, but, you know, the reality here is a lot of those regulations and health department things were about businesses and areas and stuff like that. And so, you know, our facilities are like a business, and if you treat them like that, if we're not, you know, supposed to have loitering areas, gathering areas where, you know, we need to set our gathering areas. And, you know, if the governor says you can have 250 people, is that 250 people in one raft, or is that 2 people in the entire recreation area? Is that 250 people on the ramp? And those are the key things you need to address when you're doing this stuff and when you're planning for it. And we did all that beforehand, and we're actually, you know, we've done great on the commercial side. You know, we're kind of still calibrating on the non-commercial side, because it's a lot harder to deal with that when we don't have as big a stick to whack people with. But yeah, we're doing very well with our commercial folks.
Judy or Liz or Bob, any other comments? Or Dan, have you heard anything from the question boxes?
Yeah, so this is.
Go ahead, Judy.
All right, so this is Judy, and New Mexico is a lot different. New Mexico, I think, is the only state that doesn't have a COVID surge, and we're surrounded by states that have 5,000 or 6,000 new COVID cases a day. So New Mexico is a completely different world. Group size limit is still at 5. except for commercial outfitters who have specific guidelines that they have to follow by the state. And so when it comes to commercial outfitting in Idaho, New Mexico, and Oregon, the BLM is going by what the state is saying and has set up for the outfitters. So in New Mexico, it's very specific. 50% for buses, they have to have dividers between each seat. They have to be wearing masks. They can only have family members within a given raft, and it has to be 5 people or less. One of our issues is that for private boaters, we have to keep them at 5 people or less, and they're seeing outfitters that have larger groups, not realizing that they have all of these really intricate policies that they have to follow, and that they're provided information by the state. So we're kind of having that issue going on. One of the other things that we are doing, like with the Rio Chama, right now we're in the low use season. As soon as the water starts going up on the 15th of July, we will be assigning launch sites for each group, and possibly having to change launch times for the outfitters and be more flexible, like Dave was saying. So ours is still an ongoing issue. We need to get the message out to the public and to outfitters that are bringing people in that you're required to wear a mask in the state of New Mexico unless you are actually doing physical activities. You will not be allowed in buildings. A lot of the visitor centers and things are still closed. Group size is still 5. Sheriff's office busted a group of 80 last night at one of our rec sites. So it's really strong here, and it's very, very likely that our state's going to close its boundaries again. So for New Mexico, it's a completely different world.
Interesting.
Liz, you got anything for us from the Northeast? Are we ready to?
Yeah. I can just give you a little, it's a long story, but since we're in a sort of different kind of a management scheme on a lot of our rivers, our partnership rivers, so we aren't in federal lands parks and have access points that are as monitored and controllable as other places in the country. It's a little bit more worrisome because people can just flock to the river and get on willy-nilly in various places. I speak mostly to the Upper Farmington River in Connecticut, where we have a river steward program through our management council, and we are working with the state. We're working with our partners to really work within the local and state, framework that they're trying to pull together. The one, it's very different from some of the experiences you have out on some of your big rivers, but we have one tubing concession on the Upper Farmington that's not even open this year. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of independent tubers in the one stretch of river that's very popular for that. And that's going to be a challenge. We have, a lot of public education, trying to work with people through social media and other things, but it's really a lot more challenging when we don't have staff out there that can really, monitor access points and that sort of thing.
Thanks. Dan, you ready for a new slide?
Yep, and I just want to mention, I haven't seen any questions from any of the attendees. And so even if you aren't, even if you don't have your microphone or your camera, please feel free to interact with us through the questions box. All right, on to the next slide.
Somebody type a question just so we know that they're getting through.
There we go.
All right, this is on to you, Doug, right?
Yeah. All right, well, this is going to echo some of the things we just heard from some of the other panelists, but I'm going to start out by talking about just sort of the biggest function that government seems to be doing these days is providing education, right? Trying to tell a story anyway, a narrative, and give people advice. And mostly from our survey, we learned that it was about distancing, right? That at the time, we weren't even talking a lot about masks, just to show you how things have changed. Now all we're talking about is masks. But At the time, we were talking a lot about distancing. And basically, the theme song has been "Don't Stand So Close to Me." And that's certainly what we've been giving advice on at ramps, on the river, at attraction sites. And that's kind of what we see in the survey, is that that's the kind of places that we've been focusing on that. A little less so about sharing camps. That's possibly also because a lot of rivers are not necessarily overnight rivers. And there doesn't seem to be as much attention being paid to distancing at rapids. Again, because it may not be that every river has rapids where people are out scouting and getting in each other's way. This picture is kind of interesting. This is a tubing festival that occurs in Helsinki, Finland every year. And it's not actually organized by any group. It's done totally through social media, and it gets kind of, it's a grassroots type thing that happens. Now, Finland has less than 300 total deaths and less than 5 a day in most days in recent past. So they're going to go ahead and have this thing again this year. And everybody's a little terrified that it might cause stuff. We heard that in Texas just today, the governor of Texas finally has decided that the tubing that occurs in massive numbers like this in Texas will not be happening. So they've closed down the San Antonio rivers. I think it's the Comal and the Guadalupe. So we've heard a little bit about that. So people are paying attention to this distance idea and the notion that some high densities are just too high. So that's one thing. Dan, you want to click on? Another question we asked was whether people were using enforcement or versus education, which were they were doing more. And sorry, I can't even read this. Was there? Have you changed the order? Is there a slide between there that was about mandatory? Yeah, sorry. Most places are still focusing on education and not regulation. And that fits with some of the things Dave was just saying, but it's a little different from what Judy was saying. And I think it just depends on your regulatory scene, whether your state's taking a strong position or whether it's taking more of an advisory position. And as we've seen, some states are changing their tune on that. You know, that's just the whole point about this this pandemic. It's changed. It's flip-flopped back and forth on several topics in the 3 months we've had it so far, and it's probably going to switch again in the future. Okay, click again. As far as how they're trying to do the education or how they're trying to do any enforcement, there's a real sense that a lot of the agencies don't have a lot of staff out there to do that. Either because they've been cut already or because of COVID concerns themselves. They don't want to have those folks out there having a lot of contact with other people for their own safety. So those are all sort of other variables that come into play. It's hard to do enforcement without contacts, and contacts are maybe not what you want to do. But we do see that some staff are on site trying to inform folks about it. And very few of them are actually ticketing people for things. So this goes back to mostly we're trying to give advice and get people to behave well. And the open question, I guess, for the panelists is, do you think that that's going to work over the long haul? Are we going to get sort of collective action? Are we going to all agree on how to do things? And based on the conversations I've had with people from across the country, both friends and families, and then people through my professional network, it's just so variable. Some parts of the country, you get shamed for wearing a mask. Some parts of the country, you get shamed for not wearing a mask. And a lot of us are confused about what to do in different settings. And it's going to be a while before we get sort of high compliance with everybody on the same page on this stuff. So I'm interested in hearing how that works out on the rivers that you guys are on. And I think it's a good time for some discussion from you folks.
All right,
Sure,
we've got it.
I was just going to mention.
You can go first, Bob. Go ahead.
All right, yeah. No, the education question is really a good one, and it's going to continue. I mean, we've worked nationally. Well, a couple of things, as Judy pointed out, and as Liz did, things are different in every state, and that was the federal approach from the beginning, right? Recognizing that there would be protocols and differences. The problem is people travel between those places, especially boaters, right? So they might think that what's good in Georgia is good in Florida, is good in New Mexico, kind of thing. So that's a challenge. So there is the Recreate Responsibly Coalition. We've worked with now over 100 conservation and recreation organizations across the country, and we worked to refine the messaging down to 6 or 7 principles, and which we've just added one on equity and inclusion actually in the last few weeks, and gearing up information campaigns on the part of the agencies along with our nonprofit and our corporate partners across the country in the outdoor realm to really ramp up, especially around the 4th of July coming up now and the summer season messaging. And that's clear and consistent between states. So the National Association of State Park Directors, the NRPA, National Recreation and Parks Association, and others have, joined together to try to create this consistent messaging, which I think will be helpful. Historically, we didn't have leave no trace 30 years ago, and now it's common knowledge and practice. Not everybody does it, right? So we'll still need enforcement, but we're going to see, I think compliance generally, been my experience, having run a few rivers since the start of the pandemic. I've noticed most people are really pretty courteous and very sort of responsible in how they interact with other groups. People wearing masks when with people they're not with necessarily. So I think we're going to see, more or less general compliance as we open up, and that's been the experience in the Park Service across all our parks. There are a few things I think, and this whole pandemic exercise may lead to a certain sort of permanent changes in how we do visitor use management and work on crowding issues and congestion issues. So in some ways, the COVID silver lining is our ability to move more quickly and more nimbly on visitor use management protocols. And so I'm really curious on what's going to stick, not just into the fall or even into next season, but what might we keep in perpetuity, because we learned that there are pretty cool practices that keep people from crowding and congestion in certain areas. So I think as we move forward, we're going to mostly focus on education, less on enforcement, and also be very attuned to local controls and stipulations, because in the fall and later this summer, and we're already seeing it in some states, sort of a resurgence in infection rates in COVID, states will start dialing back their phases. And so that's where I think it'll be the biggest challenge if states and localities move back due to increased infection rates, and then we have to sort of retrain everybody or to get increased compliance on what people thought they used to have to do. So, all the work that's been done, I think, has highlighted some excellent crowd control practices across the country. And I hope a lot of them kind of stick around.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Bob. I've got some questions from the question box that I'd like to address. First of all, is this tubing slide image current? No, it is not. This is just Doug's current favorite crowding picture, and also it's an open question whether or not this festival will be happening this summer, which also makes it interesting.
Right. It's the last weekend in July or the first weekend in August, I think, is when they do it. And the word on the street is they're going to do it, but who knows? And of course, the government could step in if they wanted to, probably. So
I think you should tell them. I think you should tell them it's just upstream from their put-in, and this flotilla is headed their way.
Yeah.
Doug, are you flying this year?
Yeah, I've gone down to Oregon once.
No, I'm to the event.
Oh, am I going to Helsinki?
Yeah.
Probably not.
They're taking a ship.
Yeah.
All right. I've got a few more questions here, Doug.
Okay.
How are permit checks being handled? What have rangers done to make this process safer?
Let's segue that. Just hold on to that thought, and
Okay.
I'll address that when I talk about commercial stuff in a second.
Okay, well, I've got one that's in education and enforcement. So is there insufficient staff to both educate and enforce, or just the enforcement?
One of the,
I'll throw it
one
out
of the
there
issues-
that, somebody else going?
Go on, Dave.
You know, one thing I'll throw out there is, you know, yeah, we're not in a mode where we are looking to, have confrontations with people. We're trying to manage them very politely. We're trying to move them. You know, big things are, you know, how we are interacting and you know, basically, you know, getting newer staff, newer rangers, seasonal rangers ready and prepared for what they're doing out there is really key. And you know, focusing on their personal safety more than anything, first and foremost in the environment is what we're doing. But you know, setting yourself up for success is pivotal in this stuff. If you don't set your facility up, if you don't set your space up, you're asking for more problems. You know, we're doing things like, you know, putting up posts, you know, whether you have that giant pile of T-posts from old highway projects or fire or whatever, you can paint them 10 different colors, put numbers on them, that type of stuff. But it's like that area just directly downstream from the ramp. You don't, you know, you want to mark that off and not let people pile up their boats right there to create that crowd space. You know, you block that off and then you know, put your T-posts up going downstream where you can go, yeah, you guys take, you know, post 5 or blue post or orange post or whatever, but you have to have somewhere to point people. Commercial side, same thing. Give your guides a chance to send the Johnsons to the blue post or the Griswolds to the, you know, post 5. You know, you do that up by the buses. You know, we've reduced the number of buses that pull up to the bus lane. So, you know, they stay outside of the facility and wait and be radioed in, just so there's more space for people to gather and be, you know, have that opportunity for social distancing where we didn't normally have it before, when, you know, we have 4 buses instead of 6 buses in the lane. And, you know, those things need to happen before, you know, you have the 4th of July mess happening. You have to have those plans, and you have to, you know, have that game in place before it comes to you, and, you know, work on those things. They're really easy to do if you think about it ahead of time.
That was actually a really great response to another one of the questions that we have, which is what types of practices are you seeing to keep crowding down? And so education is definitely one we've heard a lot about, but then I think Dave just gave some great examples of structural changes that you can do to help prevent some crowding. So it'd be worth thinking about if there's other kinds of structural fixes like that would work in your place.
And some things that we're doing for the BLM, we cannot necessarily enforce state policy, i.e. in New Mexico, the group size of 5. So what we are doing, like Dave was saying, is we are looking at our management tools for our river permits. Our river permits have been decreased to 5 from 16. But in terms of the campgrounds, our campground size for each campsite is normally 8 to 10. So we're not opening our campgrounds. We're going to open our campgrounds as day use to disperse use along the river corridor, but not open them for camping. So the only camping that's going to be allowed is on the rivers, which, as you all know, as river folk, is self-controlled by the groups that want to stay by themselves and not be in large groups on the river. So we're doing those kinds of things. And then when we start going to our high use for the Chama, for the high water, if we find congestion on the boat ramp, then we are going to be assigning boat launch times and locations. And in the state of New Mexico, you do not have to wear a mask, excuse me, when you're recreating, but we're asking through education for them to wear it when they're going to the bathrooms or when they're launching or taking out in groups that are not their group. So it's a combination for us about management tools and education. If we have large groups like that 80-person group, then we bring in law enforcement from the sheriff's department, not from the BLM. But we're signing. We have Spanish and English signage out there talking about the safety and the requirements and referring to the state guidelines and hoping that they will follow. So that's how we're managing it here in New Mexico. It's management practices. If they fail to manage safely and protect our users, our volunteers, and our employees, then we'll take a step back. So that's how we're managing it.
Thanks, Judy. Doug, you want to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, we better do that.
Yep. And we've got a couple more questions, and we'll stop again for questions soon, and we'll get to those.
If you could give me one more, just one quick message that, we're asking people, we're not telling people what to do as much, and we're not getting into the debate over whether the disease is real or not. We're coming at it from the resource of, can you help us keep the river open? We're just one hairline away from, management shutting this sucker down. Can you help us keep the river open? Could you stay away from other folks? All it takes is a health department to drive by, anything like that. Could you help me keep the river open today, please? And it's a lot more effective than law enforcement or anything else.
Right. That's great segue, Dave. The biggest tool that you have in your toolkit for commercial use, of course, is the permits. And they all know, I think they're acutely aware that if things go bad, say there's a super spreader event caused on one of their buses or whatever, it's going to have a big ripple effect for their industry for years to come. And so they're acutely aware of that, and they're really interested in trying to make things work. So the open question is, how are they doing that, and what are they doing, and how's that work? Again, this survey occurred back in the middle of May, and at that time the question was, are you going to even let these outfitters go? At that time it was an open question, and you can see that about a third were going to not let their outfitters go. A third were going to say yes, and another third or so were going to say yes, but not quite yet. And now here we are 2 months later, and clearly a lot of rivers are open, although a few have some fairly strict restrictions on them. The theme has been, like Bob talked about, of letting industry lead the way and letting states and counties lead the way. The federal government, with all due respect to you federal employees, has not done much in terms of a national standard for quality here, or setting national standards for how to do these things safely. And maybe that's appropriate because the disease is so is acting differently in different places and over time. So maybe it makes sense to have stricter things in places where there's outbreaks and less strict where there isn't. On to the next slide, Dan. Yeah, so the main thing, the actions that people are taking, there's a few places that are doing things like fewer launches, but the biggest deal is that outfitters have been sort of taking the lead on making their own transportation and procedures work well. That's that 78% having disinfectant systems. And then the other big choice here is to make your group smaller. And a lot of the outfitters are doing that. In particular, one of the most common themes is to make the people on the boat be from the same household or from at least the same social bubble. And how they define that and who gets to define that is kind of an open question. We've had a lot of discussions with different outfitters about how that works. And there's a little bit of a don't ask, don't tell. Sorry to mix that metaphor in there, but you tell people, come with your own group that you're willing to let drive together to the put-in, and they'll put you on the same boat with those people. Now, whether they're actually living in the same household and whether or not they're transmitting the disease is a little unknown with regard to that. But agencies, by and large, are not making those decisions. And again, it's really up to the outfitter in most cases, it appears. Give me the next slide. Sort of the biggest problem, aside from distancing problems on a boat, if you mix households on the same boat, is how you handle the transportation. So a lot of places, whitewater trips, for instance, mix households on their boats, but even if they don't mix them on their boats because they have enough boats, they still mix them in buses. And so the big open question is kind of how many people can you stuff into a bus and be safe? And I don't think we have a clear answer on that, but there's a lot of places that are working on bigger buses with less seats being taken as one variable, or trying to get people to do their own shuttles as the other variable. And we've heard examples of all of those things. We've heard more plans to do the mixing households on the same bus with everyone wearing a mask than we've actually seen it happen. So I'm interested in whether or not anyone, particularly you, Dave, or Judy up in Taos, Box, or Chama, whether you've got people mixing households. I'm guessing not in New Mexico because you got to the group size of 5. But Dave, are they mixing groups on buses?
Yeah, we are. Bus seat between them. Families can sit together, but there's got to be a bus seat between them, and there's always got to be an entire bus row behind the drivers. Everyone has to wear a mask.
Okay. And we just don't. I guess there's public transport being offered in many cities around the country where people are on buses, even if they're lower capacity. Yeah. And I haven't heard about super spreader events on those buses or public transport, but I guess that's still an open question of whether that's a way to transmit this disease or not.
Windows have to be down. One of the big things, Doug, is I'm looking at this coming in July. It's really hard to say, you can only have 10 people in a boat, things like that. If, I know the governor's right around the corner and he's, just about to say that, 25 people can sit at a 4-person restaurant table and have to kiss the bartender with their tongue on their way out. It's really hard to have these restrictions and say, these are for your safety if the governor's, fighting against you.
And in New Mexico, we actually, for the outfitters, it's 50% capacity for buses. It does not specify that they have to be family groups or relatives or people who live together. Every other seat has to be empty, and I cannot remember if it's in fact true that they have to have plastic panels between them, but I do know they have the plastic panels between the public and the driver, but I can't remember off the top of my head if they have to have it between seats. And that's a New Mexico governor standard.
And masks on your buses, Judy?
Masks on the buses in any public spaces, outside, indoors, unless you are physically recreating.
Great. Well, there's an interesting thing about those dividers. We were trying to do a study down on the Upper Klamath River, which is California and Oregon. So 2 different states, 2 different counties. With different rules, and we were trying to figure out how to do things, and we were thinking about putting shower curtains between ourselves and the drivers so that we could mix households in different vehicles and things like that. There seems to be at least some group of people that think that these plastic dividers, kind of a splash guard, is a helpful thing, and there are other people that think that just the masks alone does the job. And then I've heard a few stories about the windows open versus closed, and whether AC just puts the aerosol in the car and spreads it perfectly, or whether windows is the best thing. I'd love to hear what the answer is there, but I don't think we have a clean answer. But it sounds like Dave is coming on windows open as the whole way to go there. That's interesting to see.
It's interesting when you're riding in a shuttle vehicle to sit there and be analyzing the air currents. So I think windows open is great if I'm the first one in the airstream. I'm not so sure if I'm the second one in the airstream. So it's a funny business, right? The other thing that we noticed in doing that same work that Doug is describing is, you kind of have all the good intentions, you've got a plan, you've kind of got it figured out, and you've gotten everybody to agree to how you're going to do things. And then it comes time to round everybody up and get to the put in. And it's like, oh, well, let's see, can't we put one more person in this rig? And there you go. Everybody's doing the best of intentions, and then you start compromising a little bit. So and I think that's just human nature, and it's not just about shuttles. That's kind of true with lots of things.
And so, Dave, one other question about your, you mentioned that you were allowing customers of whitewater companies or maybe fishing companies to bring their own vehicles and do their own shuttle. So how are they doing their own shuttle? Are they bringing a bike along on the trip? Are they?
I didn't say on shuttles, but whitewater customers are actually allowed to drive to the river. I probably have about 8 fishing companies maybe that are actually paying for shuttles for their customer vehicles, having their customers drive, follow them to the river, that whole thing, and have their vehicles shuttled to the takeout. Don't have that, I think, happening in the whitewater world. They're being shuttled back on the bus with masks, that type of thing. But if they feel more comfortable, they are allowed to bring their cars. What's happening more than most often, they want to be on the bus more than they want to be bringing their own cars.
So they're saving one shuttle ride from town to the put-in, as opposed to, but they're not saving the shuttle back from the takeout back to the put-in.
No.
Okay. All right. And then the people that are shuttling for fishing trips, they're having a person get into their car and breathe all over it, but they're okay with that. They just sanitize after, kind of a thing.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Judy,
We did bike shuttles on our study. We had one sort of a 9-mile bike shuttle, and the other was about a 3-mile bike shuttle. But that's only doable if you really have committed folks. And I'm not sure that's a viable thing for a whitewater company necessarily. So.
All right, we've got a couple of questions that I'd like to address really quick. Has anybody heard of COVID spreading events that were associated with whitewater? Does anybody have data about that? I haven't heard any.
I think the COVID research on this communicable disease is similar to all other diseases. It's enclosed spaces for extended period of time. The World Health Organization in May did a study of over something like 12,000 outbreaks across the world, and only one was found to have originated in an outdoor environment. And so I think, questions of whether windows are open on buses is almost moot. I mean, nobody's opening the window at 30,000 feet on an airplane, and they have certain practices, right? And so I think we can learn a lot from the practices that we're seeing, across industry. We've seen across the Park Service agencies and all the agencies as sort of a congealing, a coalescing of practices, of pre-trip screening, of checking staff, of face masks, of food service, and everything else. So I think we've got it down to where we're mitigating as best as possible. There are outlying states that are very conservative, like Maine, New Mexico, and then there are others who have virtually no protocols in place. So we defer then to the CDC guidance. All the agencies have, you said there's no federal guidance, but there is clearly Center for Disease Control. So I think that's the baseline we're using across all these activities. And my question to the group is, are we overreacting a little bit? And is there opportunity for looking at what we see in the rest of the industry and the rest of the country that we can learn from for river management specifically? I think one thing I've seen that's pretty innovative is being able to call in for your launch on the San Juan River. Why didn't we do that before? Would be my question, right? Virtual connectivity to our launches and other things is an interesting prospect. So that's sort of a larger question I would have to play a little bit of the devil's advocate here. Are we overreacting and worried in a way that we are constraining activities when we probably don't have to?
Bob, this is my first pandemic.
I think it's the first for all of us, right? And so I said, common sense and following the research and looking at what industry practices are, like on airlines, clearly your chances of contracting coronavirus on an enclosed space with recirculating air is extremely much higher.
You know any school buses that have HEPA filters on them? Because I don't. I think
no, but
I would not. I'd rather get in an airplane than a bus.
Yeah, the research is on duration, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, in close proximity with a highly infected person. So I think we can work through all these protocols and do what's appropriate. But shower curtains, really? I get down to it. I'm like, seriously, I don't know if that's something that is actively effective. And I think that we're seeing this opening up now and a resurgence, but it's all the contagion is occurring in large group masses. So, you know, the things like Judy was talking about, 80 people convening, that just is not a good scene. And so as we can, you know, practice and allow the industry to sort of follow what is now congealing as common practices, I think is important, because they're drawing it from the medical interests, the law enforcement, the first responders, all have been doing this stuff for quite some time and working in environments that are highly contagious and not becoming contagious. So there's some practices there we need to look at as well.
So in the spirit of devil's advocate, so fair enough about being the devil's advocate, I'll be the devil. I'm not sure it's anywhere near so clear to me, Bob, as some of the things that that you kind of just rattled off. So I take them in the spirit that you offered, which is devil's advocacy. I'd say an airplane is pretty different from a bus in lots of ways, including the sophistication of the air circulation system. And I agree. The general principle you just said about larger amounts of time and closer proximity and larger numbers of people all increasing the odds, but within some of those general principles, there's a lot of variability. So anyway, hey, yep. we should mind our time here and keep moving.
Yep, Bo. So I've got a couple of comments from the questions box that are on this topic. So I have one person saying that extended period of time is actually only 1 minute. Nursing homes are reporting the virus is being passed in less than 10 minutes of contact in several cases. And the same person is citing a case where a single nurse infected all 11 people she had come into contact with during a day, and that some of those interactions were really short. But I have another comment that says Washington public health official says an extended period of time was identified as 15 minutes. And I think that just goes to show what we've been talking about, that different environments can be really different. And there's a lot of data out there, but there's a lot of disagreement among the data, and it's hard to know what's going on. And then one more person says there have been studies showing that air replacement, like open windows, is better than recirculated air conditioning without open windows. And with that, I think Bo will go on to this next slide. And you're right, we are short on time, so let's try to keep it moving.
Yeah, we should just kind of wrap up the established program here, and then we can run an ongoing discussion as long as people want to do that. Okay, we got a couple of more topics here. Non-commercial use was another topic that was addressed on the survey, so we should have a graph here, Dan. There we go. So the question was, what actions are you taking to manage non-commercial boating use? And you can see the things that all got roughly a third said they were doing those things: fewer launches, smaller group size limits, only household groups, and portable toilet or wag bag kind of systems were required. And that's, those were the things that were in the most common category. Fewer were reporting that they were limiting to locals only or providing disinfectant mechanisms. All right, next slide, Dan. And then this is our last topic that we've got a graph about what % of visitors are observing 6-foot distancing at ramps and parking areas. So this is just asking people to give us their estimates. Some people identified their estimates as broad estimates. WAGs, I think, was the acronym that's commonly used. But at any rate, interesting to kind of get the reports here, right? And so we have it in 2 different categories. This is the ramps and parking areas. And you see that you've got the tallest bar here at in the 60 to 80% said that, 60 to 80% compliance was reported by about a third. Okay. And then it's interesting to compare that to this other, which is specifically for on the river and beaches. And what you see here is that people are reporting in general a little bit higher compliance in the places where it's easier for people to comply, right? Where they aren't quite so pinched together the way they are on the ramps.
All right, that's our scheduled program. Thanks everyone for joining us. If anyone has to run, I see we're at the end of the hour, so we understand if you have to go, but anybody who wants to stick around, we've got a couple more questions and more discussion coming. So let's see here. Let's go back to this one. How are permit checks happening, and what are rangers doing to make the process safer?
Liz, do you have those kinds of permit checks happening in the Northeast?
In the areas that I'm familiar with, it's really not a permit situation at all, unless maybe the state has some permitting in state areas or something like that, but nothing that I'm familiar with. It's really all just when, first come, first serve, crowd as you want. That's why we're sort of trying to work with partners, all the powers that be, to kind of look at different ways to communicate with folks, to, disperse the use, disperse getting onto the river, staying apart from each other and not having the large congregations of groups that we've seen a lot of. But we don't really have the ability to work on permits in our scenarios unless we can get each of our individual local governments to work on something like that, which is a little ways off, I think.
Okay. Judy, do you have something that, kind of face-to-face permitting things that would address that question?
Yeah, so ours is a bit unique. On the Rio Chama, it's actually, our launch is on a private property, and they have restricted their permit application to the trip leader only is allowed to enter the building with a mask, fill out the paperwork, and then leave, and only one person in the building at the time. And then on the launches for both the Rio Grande and the Rio Chama, is we are asking all trip leaders to make sure their equipment is out and ready to be inspected. If we inspect them, we basically just want to go over, look really quickly, and then leave, have as much minimal contact as possible. If they have river management questions, flow questions, we're asking them to do that either online or via the phone, so that we limit face-to-face contact as little as possible.
Okay, great, thanks. Dan, do you have other questions there? And Dan, you could turn your camera on, it looks like, if you want to.
Okay. All right, who supersedes their authority to regulate orders? County public health director supersedes state order. And what about federal orders and the managing agency? This is a great question. What do we do with overlapping jurisdictions?
I think we heard from Dave that he's basically looking for state and county guidance, particularly state, I think, right? You were saying your governor has is kind of the one giving you pressure, and you're not looking to your head of the Forest Service to tell you what to do.
This is a delicate one. When this kind of all started, there was a lot of people looking to Washington for direction that didn't immediately become apparent. At that time, it was ski resorts going, are you guys going to shut us down? What are you going to make us do? It was very much kind of, we're not hearing anything. We're not getting leadership or direction from Washington. You either need to shut yourself down or wait for the state or the county or somebody, but it's, we're just getting a dial tone right now. It's, what the Forest Service went to was, we're not going to make any rules. We're not healthcare experts. And that's, what a lot of questions are today is, why aren't you doing this? Have you ever, why, have you read this study, this and that? We're not healthcare experts. We're not in that business. We're not doctors. We're tree people. So we are deferring to our local departments of health, whether it's the county or the state virologist or anything like that, because they are the experts. And if they're going to set rules and regulations, we defer to the CDC because they are the experts. And so that's the tack that the Forest Service has taken throughout all this, is that we'll go along with what they're saying because they know more and they're smarter about this stuff. And, you know, we'll go sell some trees. But we defer to that, and it served us well early on, but now, you know, it depends which political mafia your state prays to in a lot of cases. But, you know, a lot of us said that, you know, you will adhere to this, you know, exactly what the state or the county or whatever says. And if you based all that and suddenly your governor says, you know, you can have 250 people now, you know, I have outfitters that are like, I can have 250 people now. And it's like, no, you still have a Forest Service allocation that you need to follow. I don't care what the governor says. You can have 2 boats with 16 people in them per launch, not 250 people in each boat. But so that's, you know, that's kind of made us rework things. And that's, you know, where I've gotten more into, you know, we manage facilities. We're not going to manage you as outfitters per se, but we still do need management facilities, and nothing's really ever changed about 6-foot distancing. Everybody still agrees to that pretty much across the country, whether it's your county, your state, or CDC, is the 6-foot distancing. And my outfitters love to run their small boats. They're allowed to generally, but it's really hard to do with 6-foot distancing. So they're all still running big boats, and so they can have their distancing. They can have they can have the family of 4 in front. They can have, you know, a few, you know, more than a thwart, 6 foot, have another family, and some can even, if their big boats are big enough, they can have another 2-pack before they have the guide. The biggest thing is we had problems with early on was realizing that there is another non-familial unit, which is the guide. He exists, he's not invisible, and he counts for distancing purposes.
You know, I might just add that, you know, we live in the USA, and what the protocol has always been is health, food service, lodging, all defers to state and local enterprise, and that's the same for federal management across the board, always been the same. So, you know, I think you know, this particular nexus is an interesting challenge for all of us, but you know, we are following what has been not only tradition, but what is the legal framework of the country. And so that's why you'll have discrepancies, and it puts the federal agencies in a hard place because we have lands in every state, right? So that means we're going to have discrepancies in how we manage because we are abiding by the state laws in those states. But we've done that with outfitters and guides for, you know, the entire time we've had outfitters and guides.
And to add to what Bob just said, for the BLM, we are also following that same process, but we're going a little deeper in that each field office is able to make their own decisions because we have to consider whether we have enough supplies, whether we have enough employees or volunteers. A lot of our employees or volunteers are high risk. Many of our volunteers no longer want to do the jobs they were doing in the past. They don't feel comfortable. In New Mexico, we also have the Pueblos who've actually closed their road systems. So there's a lot of different things that each field office has to take into consideration when we are going to determine what we are going to do and how we are going to do it, and if we have partners involved. And then we're also taking in the New Mexico and CDC policy and BLM policy. So it's for the BLM, it can be different within each field office, not just within each state. So there's a lot going into our decision-making process.
Yeah, I would have to echo that. In our Northeast rivers, I think it's very different in all the different little spots, and it's on the partnership rivers, much more a locally based decision-making kind of thing. And as you were saying, Judy, staffing and volunteers. And one nice thing, another little silver lining about this whole thing is that this is across the board everywhere. So the general public kind of understands that this whole thing is going on, and it's not just a recreational issue, it's across the board everywhere. So thankfully, there's always those renegades out there who want to do things their own way, their own time, and everything else. But in general, I think the general public understands the seriousness of this, and so most people are pretty courteous and work within their local constraints. That's what I've observed.
As
It
a
really
social
helps
scientist,
with other agencies, across the board. We set out, it's like Park Service County and Forest Service and Monica for BLM downstream. It's like, let's work together. Let's open things at the same time, have the same boat loads, that type of thing. So we aren't trying to explain, why, you can have 3 fishermen in a fishing boat and you can't have a fishing boat in this agency. And, that works a lot better because you explain less. And there's a lot less health questions, science questions, that type of thing. And of course, immediately when you set out to do that, one agency breaks ranks and lets something happen that nobody else can do. But locally, if you can do that, that's great.
Doug, did you have something?
Yeah, as a social scientist, one of the things you try to do in life is try to figure out what people are thinking and how they're responding to situations. And I think this brings out the whole thing that I have a problem with this response of there's 50 different states, so 50 different rules, and then there's 3,000 counties in America, and there's potentially 3,000 different rules, and then our agencies cross those boundaries, and our information crosses those boundaries, and our public crosses those boundaries. So we're left in a state of confusion, and I think that's the biggest thing that I see out of this pandemic is that there isn't a national response. With all due respect to you, Bob, I understand that there is at a general level, and the CDC tells you the main things, but how those get implemented on the ground is very, very random and different as you cross the country. And as a result of that, people don't know what the right rules are in the place they're at unless they're paying close attention. And even those of us who are trying to pay close attention, I mean, we designed this study, we get paid to do this study in the Upper Klamath. We had 2 counties, 2 states, and a month and a half to figure it out. And we still, on the ground, had questions the day of as things evolved and as you actually try to implement these things. And I'm just saying it's confusing. Therefore, it's not going to be perfect. Therefore, we're going to have mistakes made. And the question comes as time goes on is how are those mistakes going to be handled? And
well, there's an overlay there of the whole kind of personal philosophies or personal politics that we've kind of come up with just among us as panelists, and also we've heard reports about. Bob, Dave, I really like your solution of on the ground or face to face with people saying, hey, I'm just trying to keep the river open here. We don't have to agree on philosophy or politics or whether this is a hoax or, we don't have to go into all that because we're not going to agree on that, but let's try to keep the river open. That's a nice, I like that. I think of that as sort of a salve to put on to kind of slow down the irritations. On the other hand, you still have to agree on what you're going to do to keep the river open, and that's challenging. So like Doug said, we saw a lot of challenges here just in 2 states and 2 counties where we had to actually figure out all the oh, and by the way, we were, kind of, are we going to be in phase 1 or phase 2? And by the way, they call it stages in one state and phases in the other, and it's not
orange or yellow phase.
All right, do we have any other questions, Dan?
Yep. So
guys, voting date. I'll see you later.
Okay.
Anyone's always
See you, Dave.
available.
Thanks for joining us.
Anyone's calling questions. Bye.
See you, Dave.
All right. So on the state river managers call this morning, some states mentioned an increase in inexperienced users who did not have good skills and did not seem to use normal channels for communication. Have you seen this? Any idea how to reach these folks? And we've definitely seen that here in Oregon. We had 5 boating fatalities in Oregon before May 7th, and they were all cases where there were no life jackets worn and the water was still cold. Usually when there was, when we have a bout of nice weather over here in Central Oregon, it gets really hot, but the lakes are still really cold. And there was one of the fatalities that was really near here where somebody fell off a paddleboard into a lake on a really hot sunny day, but still died.
Yeah, one of the things we think is going to happen is that if you can't go to the mall because the mall is closed or because it's unsafe, more people are going to go outside, the thing that's supposed to be more safe. So it's possible that we're going to get more use than usual, especially in local areas, and maybe not even whitewater focused, just folks out on rivers hanging out because it's a safer place to be. And that's a great thing, right? In general, we want people to be outdoors. We think that's the right place for them. But it also means that we need to manage them because they're going to be in places that they don't know how, doing things that they may not be good at yet, or they haven't figured out. So there's probably some work to be done there, but it's an open question of how we're going to do it because our own staff isn't out as much, perhaps, because it's also less safe. Those are all tricks.
It's a perennial kind of thing, even outside of the pandemic, reaching people to be safe on the river, because especially in a situation where we're not really managing the whole area and people can get on at any time. People get on in the middle of the night in a raft with no life vests and crash and have to be rescued. And, I mean, you have stuff like that go on all the time. So that's one of the things that we're constantly grappling with as educators in a way, is outreach people to how else besides just at the river are we going to educate people. And sometimes we think about a marketing campaign where we're reaching people where they live before they even leave the door to go out to the river. Is it in the schools? Is it on, public service announcements? Is it Instagram? Is it Facebook? How do we get messages out there so people are actually learning a little bit about river use, when it's safe, all the different etiquette, especially right now with COVID. So that's some of the things we're grappling with all the time. And I think we just need to do more of it right now.
Yeah, I agree with that, that we've heard those stories before. If you read the, American Whitewater kind of publishes each year an accident report of, accidents on rivers and particularly fatalities. And it's just another version of what you just described, Dan, people without life jackets. Obviously, there are some situations where people get into trouble in tight spots that are sort of legitimate, what you might think of as a legitimate place to get in trouble, but a lot of it is just fairly straightforward. By the way, what you mentioned, Liz, about working with your other stakeholders and other resources like that, we worked with American Whitewater on this project that Doug was describing down on the Klamath, and they've done a lot of work as a stakeholder group with their membership or the people that their influence group, which is maybe different from their membership. Trying to encourage people to behave differently, partly to comply with regulations and partly just to not appear to be doing something stupid or irresponsible.
We've seen in the Park Service across the board, doesn't matter what the activity is, an uptick in accidents and fatalities, primarily novice and new people coming to the outdoors, whether that's, rock climbers couldn't climb in gyms. So all of a sudden they all are going outside, right? And they're doing trad climbing for the first time. Same thing with boaters and tubers. Many places, swimming pools were closed at the start of summer. People started swimming in the creeks and rivers, So a couple of things on that, on the national perspective, is that we're looking at and have been talking to New Zealand and Canada and the UK. They have a very rigorous, what they call Adventure Smart program. You can Google it. It's basically outdoor safety in the leave no trace kind of ethics framework. And so we're now busy trying to think about this new Recreate Responsibly effort nationally. Does it morph into an educational campaign that emphasizes safety and preparedness and understanding? Because what COVID has sort of illuminated is a couple of things, and one is that the importance of local, close to home outdoor recreation opportunities is paramount, and more people are doing it, and more inexperienced people are doing it. So this might be an opportunity to sort of accelerate the work on safety and awareness moving forward.
Maybe we should call it. I think we're losing people on our attendance list, and we're running at least we're 20 minutes after, or half an hour. I can't say what time it is.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, Doug, I've just got one last thing to say here. So thanks to everybody very much for coming. And if you're interested in looking at any COVID guidance documents, they're all posted on the RMS website. Our report is linked on that same page. And it's also been published in the summer 2020 issue of the RMS Journal, which is available on the homepage at the RMS Journal icon. And we'll also include links to those pages in the debrief documents that we'll send out sometime early next week. Do you have anything else, Doug? Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, that was good. And I just wanted to thank everybody as well, and appreciate. It's been interesting this whole 3 months or so as this thing is developed, trying to pay attention to it and watch how it's developed. So we've been interested and appreciate your interest as well.
Yeah, thanks again to our panelists. Appreciate your helping us out. And thanks again to our partners at River Management Society for hosting and providing the invitations and mailing list and that sort of thing. If that's it for the good of the order, I guess we'll close it up.
All right, thanks.
Be safe out there, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.